I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Kaurna people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
There is such vibrancy in Australian wines, and it's awful to think that people need to maybe shy away from talking about that just so that it can fit in with a more maybe European style or paradigm on what the wine's meant to be. So, yeah, I think shouting out the strengths of what we do is important.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Rob Mack is the winemaker and co-owner of Aphelion Wine Co, based in McLaren Vale. Since launching in 2014, he has gained a reputation for his affinity with Grenache and his obsessiveness with quality and value. Hi, Rob. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Shanteh. Really good to chat.
Well, it's definitely overdue, and I apologise that it's taken so long. It's always been on the list to do, but we're finally here.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I'm looking forward to having a chat over the next few minutes and having a good catch-up.
So 2014, I mean, you've been in operation for a while now. I see the wines everywhere, which is a good thing because you have such a beautiful spread of wines. But let's go back in time and tell me a little bit about where you grew up and kind of what young Rob Mack was all about.
Yeah, no worries. So, first thing to note probably is I don't come from a wine family, so didn't actually grow up in a wine region or anything like that. But I was about 2 kilometres away from McLaren Vale, which was a nice place to grow up. So this is my home. Effectively, I was down here quite a lot when I was a kid, riding bikes and doing bits and pieces like that. So it was a lovely place to grow up, right on the beach here, and we're near the hills too, and just so much to do as a kid. It was pretty impossible to get bored, which was a nice start, I think. Just lots of good mates to hang out with, which was nice, and no wine focus until well and truly later in life.
It's such a beautiful part of the world, McLaren, and unlike a lot of other places where they're close to beaches, people do have a bit of a beach lifestyle there, don't they?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of the winemakers live, in the houses along the coast here, from Sellex at the south of the region, sort of tracing away up to Silver Sands and Aldinga and up through to Moana. There's a lot of just lovely spots, and they're not what you call surf beaches. They're not sort of the traditional East Coast beaches, I guess, but they're just lovely, still water, crystal clear, and a lot of people who come down here find it tricky going home. So it's a lovely place to live.
Yeah, I've always just kind of struck me how picturesque it was. So what did you do at high school? What were the kind of subjects you liked, and what did you think you were going to be when you were young?
Yeah, so the subjects that drew me in were always the more organic science subjects, so biology especially, and also geography. So slipping in with those sort of subjects, they were my strengths. I would say I wasn't super strong on on sort of the chemistry and the physics and the maths side of things, which is interesting given the direction I've gone down with a couple of university degrees, which I'll talk about later. But when I was growing up, it was certainly the more thinking about how life sort of connects, in nature and that side of things, and then exploring different parts of the world as far as studying the geography and that side of things. So there was those two sides of school that really drew me in, and I kind of neglected some of the other ones a little bit, but that's just how it turned out. I had a good bunch of mates who sort of we were going down the same path, we all clicked really well.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a subject that we just absolutely disregard. I had plenty of them. So what did you do after school?
Yeah, after school was interesting. I was sort of a bit of trying a few different things at uni, which, none of them really clicked. I just don't think it was the right time of life, coming straight out of school and into university, which, it's different for everyone. Some people can really thrive going straight from study to study. I think I just needed that sort of breath of fresh air after 12 years of school. So, I tried a couple of things, but nothing really stuck at that point. So I just went straight into work, really, with a few different sort of logistics jobs and bits and pieces. And that sort of kept me going for a few years before then. I think I kind of, after that, got the desire to go back to uni and have a proper crack. which is where I started down the study pathway and haven't really stopped, to be honest. So it's one of those things that I think you sort of get addicted to learning a bit sometimes, and that's still the phase I'm in.
Yeah, I was the same. I couldn't settle. I wanted to do too much and see too much. And yeah, I think that those gap years and those times between kind of schooling and before you go into university are really important for some people, not for everybody. But I really enjoyed seeing the world. So was it this one bottle of Barolo that kind of changed your path? Was it that simple that you drank something and went, wow? Or tell me about how the wine bug bit you.
Yeah, I think most people who are really passionate about something can usually draw to a single event or something close to a single event. I was in my mid-20s at this point, and I was starting to come off the more sort of simple drink options and exploring the world of finer wine, and still no real education or knowledge about sort of things. It was just through trying and listening to people who knew a lot more about it than I did. But yeah, there was this one evening when I did try a bottle of Barolo, and it just blew me away how a wine could have that level of sort of sophistication and elegance and layers of flavour and texture and all these different components that went into it. And that is one of the events I still remember that contributed to putting me on that path and really wanting to not necessarily at that point turn it into a career, because that still wasn't really part of my thinking, but just get me into a really a headspace that wanted me to follow wine and realize that it was such a worldwide thing, and not just looking at domestic wine anymore, but branching out to France and Italy, Spain, Europe, America, all through these places that just have such different styles and intriguing great varieties and regions.
I mean, it is such a rabbit hole, isn't it? When you kind of get the bug and you go, oh, this is interesting. And then you're like, whoa, this is huge, this world of wine. So when did you kind of think, there's wine in McLaren Vale? When did that kind of 2 cents kind of hit? Yeah,
that was sort of around the same time, I'd say. Maybe a bit before that, because I remember some of the earliest wine purchases that I used to make were, the classic McLaren Vale Shiraz wines that just, they're so nice just to sink into a glass of those, and they still are. They've sort of gone out of fashion a little bit since then, but I still have a pretty good collection of those wines. So yeah, McLaren Vale has been on my radar since the real early days. I'd say not so much Grenache. That was a later thing. I think Grenache is a variety that, when it's in its best form, it can take a little bit of knowledge to understand what those wines are all about. So that came a little bit later. But yeah, in the early days, McLaren Vale, Shiraz in particular, and Barossa too, all those sort of classic regions were pretty high up on my domestic radar anyway.
And so when did the idea of, I want to start my own wine brand, and what did your wife have to think about that?
Yeah, so look, this was back in 2014. So from school, I moved to Sydney for a bit, and that's where I met Louise, my wife now, and I stayed there for about 7 years before we moved back to Wollonga in McLaren Vale, which was in 2013. So it was only 1 year after that we started the Aphelion label. I guess an important note is that for the first 3 years, really, it was, as a lot of winemakers do, a bit of a side project, a bit of a vent of more classic roles that they have as an assistant winemaker or what have you. So it started off tiny, and we didn't have to invest much in the way of cash into it because it was so small. It was literally 1 ton of fruit, so looking at about $2,000 for that, and then a couple of barrels, and that was sort of it. So there was no real barrier to entering at that volume. But it was that was a great volume to play around with, to experiment with different techniques and couple of different blocks. My main grower is that same grower that we first purchased fruit from all those years ago. So forging those relationships early on when Grenache wasn't actually very popular back then. So we could almost walk into any vineyard back then and say, I'll grab some of that, grab some of that. It's 8-year-old Grenache, no worries, we'll grab some of that. Can't do that anymore because people have realised that it's such an amazing resource that we have here that's so tightly held. It was probably about 3 years into the project when we decided to throw a bit more at it and move from that sort of 1 to 2 tons up to, I think it was 19 tons in 2017. So that was the year where we kind of decided to make things a bit more commercial volume, I guess, that we could supply more than just, the local friends and family and local businesses here. And that's when we could start really looking, into the Sydney market, into the Melbourne market, even a little bit of export out to the UK in the early days too. So that was the jump. So that was probably the scary part, I think.
Yeah, it definitely sounds scary, but the way you put it, in terms of it, like a lot of people, you don't just start a wine brand and start making money. It's a slow burn. And tell me, where were you working at the time when you kind of first, like you said, bought that first ton of fruit?
Yeah, so my first vintage was in 2010. That was up in Clare at Killicanoon. And then there was a little bit of a gap because I was still living in Sydney at that time. So when you moved back here, I started working with a company called McLaren Vale Winemakers. So very small scale. I think it was around 100 tonnes that they do, which sounds like a lot, but it's certainly not in the scheme of things. Sorry. So a lot of small batch ferments, 1 to 2 ton ferments, bits and pieces like that. So it was a great little place to really learn that side of the business, which is still the backbone of what we do now. Very small ferments, making as many different options as possible from a single pick of fruit for me to play around with when it comes time for blending. So I'm very happy that I was in that role for a number of years and had some really, really great people around me that we just sort of experimented and played with. And I could do it with my own 1 ton of fruit, but then I could almost kind of do it with the other 100 tons of fruit as well to see what would happen.
It's interesting because I, as a person that always really admired Grenache, it's right in my wheelhouse of some of the wines I love the most. I remember in the early days, going back kind of early, 2010, 2011 kind of, I remember loving Grenache, but not being able to find a focus of producer that I liked their style of, because I felt it was hit and miss, whether they were quite big and rich or they were blended away. And I remember, a lot of people like Alex Head and that coming forth and putting these styles in front of me and being like, oh, that's what I'm after. And knowing Chateau Neuf producers that I loved, but not quite figuring out what I liked here. And then for a young brand like yours, which does still feel young, even though you've had a long history, you came out of the gates with a very clear focus of the wine styles that you like to make. And they really hit a point where nobody, I felt, was really doing that kind of style. Is that something that you planned, or is that just how the wines turned out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it definitely was a plan. One of my strengths or weaknesses, I don't know which one, but it is, I do get quite meticulous on forward thinking and forward planning and not necessarily getting upset if it doesn't happen, but at least putting a proper approach and a thought process into play. And it's interesting you say about sort of styles around 2010, 2011. I certainly was using some of those local wines that I felt were doing it really well as, I guess inspiration is probably a good word for it. I wasn't trying to emulate those, because what I was trying to do was kind of seeing in the past what these blocks of fruit could do out of Blewett Springs in particular, and more recently Clarendon, but seeing how that fruit responded to a bit of a lighter touch and a bit of less extraction, less maybe less pressure in the press, to all these sort of things. So seeing the quality and the elegance, I guess, and the finesse that fruit could make was the focus of what we decided to move with for our kind of house style, I guess. I never fight against what a site wants to do in a given year, so there's always going to be plenty of vintage variation and things like that. I'm not trying to make a a product that tastes the same every year, because that's sort of, there's no point. I may as well just be making something else that's a lot easier to replicate. But to have at least a style in mind that suits the fruit that we're working with year to year is sort of, that was my plan almost, pretty early on. So I'm glad that it shone through even from those early days.
Oh, definitely. And yeah, the range of wines that you had, and it was a very strong showing from the outset, and it caught on really quick, because I remember looking around and being like, I've got these cool wines, and then being like, oh, everyone realizes they're good. Damn it, Tell me, how did you come up with the name, and what was that kind of conversation like?
Yep. So in the early days, we were sort of tossing around. Obviously, there's a couple of options. We could either use our own name, as many producers do, or we could have found a term or a phrase that sort of fitted with our ethos around the vineyard and the site taking the primary focus, and using the sort of nature and the whole sustainability aspect as well, and sort of trying to tie all that together. So the term Aphelion, there's a few different ways you can sort of categorize it, but the way we chose to, which was a literal adaptation from the ancient Greek term, which is from the sun. So it sort of just tied in nicely with a focus on the vineyard side of things, and the light touch, I guess, as well, that is a key to how I make our wines, is really watch over them closely, but don't interfere more than I have to. So it worked out quite nicely, I think, as a name, and it just sort of rolls off the tongue quite softly and nicely as well, which also sort of ties in well.
And then you've really embraced some of these terms of which we all know of that Australia is known for, like sunshine in a bottle. And I really appreciate that, because I think that because of what that came to mean later down the track, people steered away from it. But I think it's one of the greatest strengths that we have, is our abundance of beautiful fruit and our wonderful ripeness that's handled so well. And I was just really thrilled to see that when I would look through your website. I was like, I love that you've embraced this. It has long, strong ties to where we come from as a great growing nation, but you're using it in a slightly different way.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I know Louise loves that phrase, so she throws that around a lot. And obviously back in the 80s, 90s, I guess late 90s, it was used quite extensively, or a phrase similar to it anyway, with exporting Australian wine, and it was very, very successful during those times. And you're right, there is such vibrancy in Australian wines, and it's awful to think that people need to maybe shy away from talking about that, just so that it can fit in with a more maybe European style or paradigm on what the wine's meant to be. So I think shouting out the strengths of what we do is important, and that phrase kind of fits in with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think she's done a great job of that. Best-selling bottled sunshine. There's a little twist on it. It's not quite, the old saying, but leaning into it, I absolutely love it. Let's talk a little bit about McLaren Vale as a region, and I'd love to get into a bit more about, Grenache, how it grows on the vine, how it does in different soil types, what it kind of displays, and the things that you've noticed, and why McLaren Vale is such a nice epicenter for it.
Yeah, look, it is. And it's being recognised as one of the absolute premier regions for in the world, not just Australia, certainly. McLaren Vale it's a really interesting region. So it's relatively sort of circular. You've got the water on the west side, you've got the hills on the other side, on the east side, and then you sort of run into the southern fringe of Adelaide and the Onkaparinga Gorge on the northern side. So it's kind of naturally bordered by all these things. The southern 2/3, I'd say, or at least southern half, is relatively flat, bit low-lying, so down sort of around maybe 80 metres above sea level. That's where you find a lot more of the heavier soils, so more clay, sort of compact soils. So good for things like Shiraz and maybe the more fuller-bodied varieties. Also slightly warmer than as you head up further north in the region, where you start from pretty much from McLaren Vale town, you start going up in elevation. So that's when usually the daytime temperatures can be about the same, but it's the nighttime temperatures that can make a difference there by dropping relatively significantly by a couple of degrees, 2 or 3 degrees compared to further south. So up into Blewett Springs, which is a term or sub-region that everyone sort of is getting quite familiar with now, especially with regards to Grenache. A lot of the old plantings are up there. And then even higher up into Clarendon, where you finish at about around 300 metres above sea level. And after that, you're sort of into the Adelaide Hills. So I think from my perspective, we work with a little bit of Grenache from the south, from our Italian grower, where we get our Nero from as well. And that fruit is great because it doesn't maybe have the layers and the finesse of the Grenache that is produced in the higher parts of the Vale, but it has this lovely juiciness, and it's great for blending in with our sort of finer, more aromatic styles for our sort of not entry. I hate the term entry level, but the level that is our gateway wines, I guess, for people who maybe don't know us and they just want to see what our sort of juicy, approachable style of Grenache is. That's the wine they go for, which is it's the Welkin range. But then we move up into sort of slightly higher, more detailed, high quality, more detailed wines, and that's the fruit that comes from Blewett's and Clarendon. Longer hang times up there, so we're picking usually probably about 2 weeks later than you would on the valley floor, due to those cooler nights, and usually more retained acidity up there too. So the wines can sometimes look a little bit brighter and a little bit fresher than from the fruit that we get a little bit further south. Often Clarendon is interesting too. It seems to provide a different structure, so the tannin feels different to the Blewett's plantings. Even if the vineyards are around the same age, it just seems like there's just this additional layer of tannin on the Clarendon wines. So I love using those as a sort of a backbone, and they're great to stand alone as well. One of the single vineyard wines that we do is off a Clarendon site, and it stands well and truly strong by itself. So yeah, it has an affinity. The variety has an affinity for this region. I think it just loves it needs warmth, and we do have that here. Certainly in years like this vintage, where it was quite warm and dry, and it has these long hang times, late ripening. So even if there is some heat early on, that can affect maybe some earlier ripening varieties, Grenache generally doesn't suffer, because we're picking in usually sort of mid-March to late March. It was a bit earlier this year, but generally it's mid to late March when most of the heat has sort of the pressure's off, and we just get these lovely, fresh, vibrant bunches of fruit, and we don't need to make any adjustments in the winery to these things. So just come in looking how I feel immaculate Grenache should.
I love that you talked about your range, because it is a dream to have a wine under $30 at that quality level for a wine buyer in a restaurant, particularly somewhere like Key, where I was always conscious of making sure we had wonderful, very affordable wines, all the way up to some of your single vineyard stuff. I think there's value in all of the entire range, and that means a lot to me. But tell me a little bit about the warming climate, and you also work with Chenin Blanc and Grenache Blanc. Are all of these choices that you're making to work with these types of grapes because of a warming climate, or just for now?
It's a combination. It's certainly not for now. So what I always try and do, if we are looking to expand out the range, which I've kind of put a hold on it for the time being, because I think that we still want to make sure we focus on our strengths and the things I love to work with, and not just bring something in just for the hell of it. We were talking about pre-planning before, that certainly comes into it. But the reason I do choose to work with those varieties you mentioned is because certainly with Grenache and Mourvedre and Chenin, where it's grown in Blewett, it might be a little bit sort of touch and go down on the flats, but up in the higher part of the Vale, it's in good nick for, or the region, the climate's in good nick for it. It is to kind of future-proof what we're doing. So we're fortunate in that the variety that is suitable to this region is actually the one that makes my preferred style of wine anyway. So I don't have to say, I'd really rather be working with Cabernet or something, but it's too hot. I'm really glad I'm working with Grenache, and it is one that's suitable. So it's kind of like a double tick for that, and also for the other varieties that we work with too. On the flip side, a good sort of point to mention is we used to work with Shiraz from 2017 through to 2020, and I was trying to craft it into a bit of a, to suit my preferred style of wine, which is kind of that classic Northern Rhône, taken to Australia, looking at maybe Moran Bateman or Adelaide Hills or Great Western, those sort of spice-driven, medium-bodied or medium plus bodied, I guess, wines. And I think I came close, but I always just felt like I was fighting with it to get it into that spectrum. So that's an example of a variety that we stopped making after 2020 and shifted the focus squarely sort of back onto where I think it needed to be. There's plenty of Shiraz in the Vale, that's for sure. And if anyone needs Shiraz out of the Vale, there's plenty of options. But I just felt that we didn't need to play in that space, and wanted to stick to the whole plan of only working with varieties that really make sense and don't need heaps of irrigation and just they thrive, especially the older vine material. Even in dry years, they might not produce as much fruit, but they hang in there and they're really tough.
That's so interesting that you're not working with Shiraz anymore. And I know you're a deep thinker. I know that there's a lot of thought process that goes into almost everything you do, maybe if you don't even talk about it, but I can see the workings behind your eyes. And I think that that's such a clever decision because, like you said, there's people make fantastic Shiraz out there. And, that idea of it's nice to know that you can give up something and go, you know what, I'm just going to leave that to somebody else and I'm going to focus on this. I think that that's really clever. Tell me a little bit about your approach with using the growers that you mentioned, because from what I see often is that many people would love to have their own little parcel of fruit they could play around with, particularly winemakers, because they like that control from start to finish. You make a decision to work with growers. What's that relationship like, and what does it mean to work with these people when you're not there every day?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it would be nice to have our own little block one day. The thing is, though, even if we did, I can't imagine not working with the same blocks that we're working with now. So I'd still probably be buying enough of our fruit from these growers because I've been working with them for so long. So one, the Brinnies from the start, the Brinnie family, the Waite family, who is another really important grower for us, was in 2016 or 17, I think, was the first time we started working with them. So they're relatively long-term, as far as we're concerned anyway, long-term relationships. And the good thing about that is that we give and take. So obviously in a good year, everyone's happy, there's plenty of fruit, that's great, and we're all laughing. In years where there's a few more problems, so say a cooler, wetter year or a really tough, dry, low-yielding year, we will still take our allocation out of our block, and we won't be saying, "Oh, that doesn't look very good this year." We'll just leave it and not do it. So we support them in years that may not be stellar quality, and they support us by allowing us to have usually first crack at our preferred block every year on those blocks. So it almost feels it's as close as we can get anyway to having our own little patch. And I know those blocks back to front because I'm walking through them all the time. It's one of those things that when we're getting relatively close to harvest, and even halfway through vintage, I'm more often in the vineyard than I am in the winery, because getting the picking time right is so crucial. If we miss that, if we go too early or we go too late, then there's really not a whole lot I can do to correct that. So we need to get it right from the start, and that's where the growers are really super responsive to picking time requests and things like that. So hand picking can be a bit tricky because it's such a labour intensive thing, but a couple of days notice and we can go. So it's, we need to make sure we work with the right people, and I think the three main growers that we've got. So Yangara is the third. Are amazing at what they do and super responsive.
Oh, that's so good to hear. Do you do a little like a little exchange of wine? I mean, do they want to drink the wine off their blocks? I imagine they would do.
Yeah, some of them do. And I'll always drop, usually every year, I'll around picking time, I'll drop a few bottles in from the previous year that's been bottled. So there's a lot of growers that aren't all that into wine. I guess they love crafting the vines and the fruit, but the finished product, they'll have a taste and that's nice, and then move on to something else. But we always try and do that. A couple of the growers that we work with, obviously Yangara, have their full suite of things. So it's always nice seeing how our Clarendon Grenache compares to their Clarendon Grenache and things like that, and stylistic differences and things. It's not so much looking about saying, this is better than that, it's better than that. It's just like, okay, so this tastes like this. What was what were the critical decisions behind you getting this wine to this style? And then I'll talk about, what I do and things like that. So it's really nice to share that information with growers who are interested. Like I say, some just, aren't all that interested, but it's definitely something we talk about.
Now tell me, I've got a couple of questions that I want to rattle off. Tell me a little bit about, have you had a mentor that has played a significant role in your career that kind of guided you in the start or even now?
There's been a few who've sort of come and gone, I guess. I wouldn't, that's a tricky one actually. I wouldn't say there's been a single person maybe that I could, and part of that is because we were talking about earlier about having a style that's a little bit different, certainly in the early days to what was happening. So I was taking inspiration from the styles that Steve Pannell was making. I remember his 2010 Grenache was one of the wines that really got me thinking about structure in Grenache, and took a few years for that light bulb moment for us to happen. But and Pete Fraser, they're the two that stylistically I sort of love to see what's going on. Drew Noon has been more recently a really good inspiration, and not even so much about wine production, but more just thinking about wine globally in general, because he's been sort of mentoring me through the Master of Wine program, and we've got had some really good chats about just wine in general. And I think that's probably even more important than getting into the nitty gritty and the specifics of a certain bottle or something like that, is just think about things on a slightly larger perspective, and draw on inspiration from as many resources as I can, which is sort of the pathway I've gone, rather than saying, okay, this person can guide me on this, and this, because I feel then I'd be a little bit blinkered into their process and their thought pattern. So I'm trying to remain as open as possible to different options, and through my playing around in the winery year to year, and occasionally I'll just be out on the bike having a ride somewhere, and I'll think of something, and I'll just try and not forget it until I get home, but then work that into the next vintage plan and see if it works. And if it doesn't, then oh well. And if it does, then great.
Well, you don't know really until you try, right? And sometimes these little light bulb moments have to be played out, otherwise they drive us crazy. Tell me about people up and coming, whose wines you enjoy drinking, or who's someone that you've kind of got on your radar for some of the stuff that you're enjoying at the moment.
Yeah, so I do have a pretty wide range of things. Like I say, I love to focus on Grenache as a production wine, and drink a lot of the local examples from the names already mentioned, along with a bunch of others. But I'd say probably the wines that I drink or taste most at home are from a bit more of a global perspective. I do love Australian wine, and it's always a go-to for me, but I always like to see what's happening around the world. It helps with my studies too. But, for example, trying Grenaches, a whole selection of Grenaches out of Spain, or even, some of the wines that are coming out of the islands around Italy, and things like that, they're doing stuff that I wouldn't even thought about. So it's using those wines as a delicious, thing to drink, but also then thinking about, okay, so how did they do that? And then I'll go back to the website, or I'll shoot them an email and say, look, there was something in this particular wine that I found intriguing, and then sort of figure out or try and figure out how what they did to do that, and then maybe play around with that the next year. So
did they ever say like bugger off and figure it out yourself?
no, look, occasionally there might not be a reply, but often it's not that hard to find. There might be a technical sheet on the website or something like that, and that'll just have like a one-liner or two-liner about the winemaking, and often there's enough detail there that I can think, oh, okay, so that's what they did. It might be they might have dried the grapes for 10 days on racks before they crushed it, or they might have used a certain type of yeast or something like this. And usually that's not too hard to find. But yeah, so I use sort of drinking or consuming wine as mostly just enjoyable and just sit back and enjoy a glass, but also just always in the back of my mind just thinking, okay, there's something interesting here. What's going on?
I told you, you're a thinker. You're a thinker.
It's hard to switch off though sometimes, I think.
I bet. It's the whole point of a glass of wine. I imagine those Sierra de Gredos and wines like that from the southern Spain you must enjoy quite a bit, do you?
Yeah, they are. So, I mean, we're talking about sort of inspiration and things like that. That is a region that for quite a while now, at least probably the last 6 or 7 years, I've been following pretty closely. Some of those wines have become sort of cult status now, and they're almost just too hard to get. But there's still heaps that are made there that are, in that maybe you can probably get them for $50 a bottle or something like that out here. That just have this amazing vibrancy and transparency of place. And I'd say, to be honest, I actually look to those wines just as much, if not more, than local wines as a style that I love to try and pursue.
I think it's such an interesting topic because it's been a bit of my go-to lately to bring an Australian Grenache to a table with a bunch of internationals, and I'm always very, very intrigued about where they sit, and more often than not, very proud to hold my head up and say, I come from Australia and look how good our wines are. But and I also wanted to ask you a little bit about, what do you think, and this is a hard question, so get ready. What do you think your greatest skill set is as a winemaker?
Yeah, that is a bit of a tricky one. It depends how far you sort of break it down, I guess. I think probably attention to detail combined with creativity, I think would be my biggest asset. So I love vintage when all the fruit's coming, flying through and everyone's running around screaming and having a great time. And the smells during harvest is something else. You can't replicate that during any other time of the year. Just the fresh fruit in the air. But I think what I love most is the part that's maybe say 7 or 8 months, 6 months down the track is once the wines have settled down, they're in barrel or vessel. We started to use a lot more cement and concrete and things like that now. But once they've just settled down and they're ready to properly be looked at, and that's when I start looking at blending options and things like that. And that's when I get really excited. Is I've got a whole patchwork of batches that I can play around with, and I'll often try and do this as blind as possible. So I'm not sort of pulled in one way or the other, because I do have occasionally favourite blocks and things like that which I'll get drawn to. But some years they don't look as good as others that maybe are considered normally slightly lesser sites. So that's where the creativity comes in, and thinking, well, how does that work with that? By themselves they may not look amazing, and then you put them together and it's like, wow, that's something interesting. And so it's the attention to detail and the creativity that combine, I think, to make winemaking really, really interesting. And I think I've got that pretty well covered.
So funny, because I just started asking this question because it's kind of, especially winemakers, they like to talk, but they don't always want to answer that question. And I always have, and I've just started doing this, writing my own little answer to see what you'd say. And mine next to yours said, meticulous attention to detail.
There you go. Oh, geez. Yeah. You know me pretty well.
Well, clearly, no.
Yeah.
The wines are beautiful. Honestly, they are. And like I said, the whole range, the value and the quality level and the interest and all the little facets that come together to make a beautiful wine are all there. I'm such a big fan. So sorry it's taken us so long to chat. Rob, if you could only drink 3 beverages for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
3 beverages. Oh, look, the first one's always going to be probably Cooper's Pale Ale. I'm sure most of the winemakers who come on say something similar, but there is certainly a lot more beer consumed than wine for a good portion of the year in the winery. So, without a cleansing ale, I'd be in a lot of trouble. Another one would be sake, which is something I fell in love with on my trips to Japan before kids. And we went there 4 years in a row during the winter there, and visiting some of the little breweries just blew me away. So I'll always have a little mixed pack of sake kicking around, just for a point of difference. Yeah, and then look, it's a pretty obvious one, but the third one's probably going to be a bottle of Nebbiolo from the northwest of Italy.
How is that? We've just been talking about Grenache for 45 minutes, and you're like, oh, it's pretty obvious, Nebbiolo.
I've got a winery full of Grenache. That's fine. It's one of those, it's just one of those wines that it always just sparks that. It makes me remember where everything started. I still, I haven't lost my passion for that region and that variety. And having worked out there as well in 2017 in Barolo, it's something that's so close to and intrinsic to my love of wine. So I couldn't not have that in there.
Totally, full circle. Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it's a very busy time, and I look forward to our paths crossing again, and thank you very much for joining me.
No, thanks, Shanteh. Can't wait to catch up in person soon, hopefully.
Hopefully. Cheers to you.
Cheers. Bye.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram @overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.